On this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast, I'm going to be going over AFC team over-unders as well as some other bets that I like. I'm recording this early in the morning on July 15th, just in case any NFL news breaks out before this is posted. And so this video will only contain AFC team over-unders and bets that I like. There will be a twin podcast to this one with NFC team over-unders and bets that I like. So I'm going to go west to east, and I'll start out with the AFC West and the Kansas City Chiefs. The over-under is at 11.5. I don't see a lot of value in betting their win total, but there are some other things that make a lot of sense to me with Kansas City. They're plus 600 right now to win the Super Bowl. I think that is a bet that makes a ton of sense. Last year, they were only plus 700. And to me, the rest of the NFL has gotten weaker since last season. Plus 300 to win the AFC. I think that's also a bet I would make. And Patrick Mahomes, plus 400 to win MVP. Mahomes somehow didn't win it last year. Lamar had the outrageously good season. Mahomes was injured for part of the year, so, Patrick Mahomes being the best player at the most important position makes him a very likely candidate moving forward. He is the favorite, but plus 400 I think is, pretty generous for the bettor. I also just think it's fun to be on Kansas City's side. Last year, I was able to get them at plus 700 before the season started to win the Super Bowl. I was able to get another ticket after the regular season ended before the playoffs started. This Kansas City team, having Patrick Mahomes is the most uniquely gifted player in the perfect scheme at the most important position, and he can do the most valuable things for you, which is throw the ball downfield. He's got all the perfect weaponry for him with Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, Andy Reid designing plays. This is just a fun team to root for, and it's always good to be on the side of the team that has this uniquely gifted player. The Kansas City Chiefs remind me a lot of the Golden State Warriors. I think Patrick Mahomes is the Steph Curry of the NFL. And I think this Chiefs team is going to be good for a long time. And it's just fun to watch games realizing that you might be down by, 17 points or whatever, 20 points to the Texans, and it doesn't really matter that much. You can relax. Very similar vibes I get as when I watched Golden State play. They're just never out of a game, and everyone knew it. So I wouldn't go with the Chiefs win total, but there are some other longer-term bets that I think make a lot of sense for this Kansas City team. So secondly, we have the LA Chargers. I've seen their over-under at 8. I've also seen it at 7.5. This team has been getting some weird buzz from people in the media. I've heard people say that the Chargers have this excellent roster. I'm just totally not with it. I think this team could actually be pretty bad. Let's start with the quarterback. They lost Phillip Rivers this offseason. They're going to be starting Tyrod Taylor, and they have Justin Herbert. So, just looking at this offense, right? The offensive line, despite adding a couple pieces this offseason, I still think is below average. The offensive line is not going to be great. You look at the weaponry, Keenan Allen, despite being a pretty good player, is one of the most frequently injured wide receivers. He's missed, almost multiple seasons due to injury. And Hunter Henry is one of the most injured tight ends, even though he's been pretty good when he's been in. Other than those two guys, they've got Austin Eckler and they've got Mike Williams. I don't think this offense is that great. And, most importantly, the quarterback situation. Tyrod Taylor is a good backup at this point. And, there's a reason why he hasn't been starting. He's not great at throwing the ball downfield. And I think the worst part about it is that if the Chargers start out like 2-4 or something, Taylor is going to be replaced pretty quickly by Justin Herbert. And I'm worried about Justin Herbert. I had more of a mid to late second round grade on Justin Herbert personally before this draft, and he ended up going 6th overall, so it was one of the biggest discrepancies of any prospect I had in this class. I think Justin Herbert has some serious problems managing pressure in the pocket. I also think he's substantially less accurate than some of the quarterbacks in this class, like Joe Burrow and Tua. When I watch Herbert play, I see a lot of Blaine Gabbert. I also see a lot of Marcus Mariota. I would be very surprised if Herbert came in and was super NFL ready right off the bat. I think this team is one of the worst sets of quarterbacks in the NFL, one of the worst quarterback situations. And for them to be projected to win almost 8 games, 8 or 7.5 games to me is very surprising. The last point I'll make is that a lot of people have complimented this team's secondary, and I agree that the secondary is talented. I think the defense could be fine. But what we know about secondaries and defensive players in general is that they're more volatile, specifically the coverage players. And so with that in mind, it's more likely that this defense would be surprisingly bad than it is that this offense would be surprisingly good. And so with that in mind, I think the Chargers could very easily be a double-digit loss team this year. So I really like the under for either 8 or 7.5. Third team in this division is Denver at 7.5. This is a team that I'm laying off of. I don't think we know a lot about Drew Lock. From everything that I watched last year, including the preseason and the end of last season, despite going 4-1 in his 5 starts, Drew Lock actually didn't play very well in those 5 games. And if you look at the people they beat, the teams they were beating had really weak quarterbacks. And even though I like Denver's roster, and I actually think Fangio seems like an okay coach, I don't feel confident enough to go with either side of this Denver team. I think 7.5 feels like the right number, so I would just lay off of the Broncos. All right, and finally, we have the Las Vegas Raiders, also at 7.5. So the Raiders have actually built their roster up in a lot of ways. The offensive line is improved. The secondary actually has some depth, and they've added a lot of pieces to that secondary. They added a couple linebackers. The defensive line is competent. Their group of receivers is very unproven, but I actually like some of their guys. With all of that being said, the one thing that Gruden and Mayock just didn't want to deal with was the most important position, which is quarterback. And as long as Derek Carr is the quarterback of this team, I don't really see the value in betting an over, especially at 7.5. This team has a pretty good roster, but Derek Carr is, pretty clearly, I think, in the bottom third of starting quarterbacks in the NFL. Especially in the past 2 seasons, he's been very conservative, not wanting to throw the ball downfield, which explains why he has a high completion percentage, but his teams lose games a lot. Carr hasn't been an efficient quarterback, despite having a high completion percentage. And the addition of Marcus Mariota doesn't really change things for me. There's an old saying where if you think you have 2 quarterbacks, you probably have 0. I think Carr and Mariota are, that's a really good combination of quarterbacks for this phrase. I think it's pretty clear the Raiders just don't have a good enough set of quarterbacks here to be a really competitive team. I think if this Raiders team were really good, it would be an outlier good type of season from one of the 2 quarterbacks, but I'd rather bet against Marcus Mariota and Derek Carr. So I think 7.5 feels like an under. I think this team could pretty logically finish 7-9, 6-10 in that area. The other thing is that Gruden hasn't proved that he is really that good of a coach. So I think there's a lot of things working against this Raiders team in the most important parts of their roster. All right, so now we move to the AFC South. The Colts are a team I'm laying off of. Their over-under is 9. Just don't see a lot of value on either side. Jacksonville's over-under is at 4.5. I'm also laying off of the Jaguars because I don't exactly know what their plan is. If they are in fact tanking, then I wouldn't feel comfortable holding an over ticket for Jacksonville. 4.5 is a very low number, so the over seems appealing. I'm just going to lay off of it because I don't know what that team's plan really is. The two teams I want to focus on are Tennessee and Houston, so I'll start with the Titans. Their over-under is 8.5. I don't feel good about this, but I'm going to take the Titans under. They have won 9 games in each of the past 3 seasons, so 8.5 is just kind of daring you to have them meet that 9-win total once again. Most of my analysis with this Titans team has to do with Tannehill. I actually think this roster is very good. It's very solid across the board. I really like A.J. Brown. I also think Corey Davis is pretty good for a second receiver. Jonnu Smith is a talented tight end. Defensively, the secondary is actually quite good. I really liked the Christian Fulton pick in the second round. I thought that was a tremendous value. You've got Fulton with Adoree Jackson as the number 1 corner. Malcolm Butler is still there. The safeties, Kevin Byard, one of the probably 5 best safeties in the NFL. Kenny Vaccaro. They've got a good set of linebackers. I think Vrabel's a pretty good coach. I think there's a lot to like about this Titans team. But I want to fade Ryan Tannehill because I think Tannehill is going to regress back to what he was prior to 2018. Because prior to 2018, Tannehill was a below average starting quarterback for the Dolphins. Then 2018 happened and Tannehill had the worst season of his career in a lot of ways. Of course, in 2019, he had by far the best season of his career. I think if you throw out these two sort of outlier seasons the past 2 years, you get a more realistic glimpse at what Tannehill really is, and that's just a below average starting quarterback. He's not bad, but he's pretty firmly not in the top 15, I would say. So basically, I think that the past 2 years have been a natural fluctuation in Tannehill's career, and I don't think the fact that the really good season came after the really bad season necessarily means that Tannehill got better. I think it was just more of a natural fluctuation. So I don't feel good about this one, but I'm going to lean under on the Titans' 8.5 win total. They're also plus 130 to miss the playoffs. I don't think you should bet a ton on that, but I do feel like there's a little bit of value on them missing the playoffs, despite the fact that there's going to be a 7th playoff team in each conference this year. I just think it comes down to, I don't necessarily think Tannehill is one of the 7 best quarterbacks in this conference. So with that in mind, I'm going to lean slightly under on Tennessee. Don't feel good about it though. So lastly in this division, we have Houston. Their over-under's at 7.5. So I hated the DeAndre Hopkins trade as much as anybody. You know, you're giving away an elite player at a valuable position for a 2nd-round pick, and you're taking what is really a bad contract for a player who plays, a position that's not so valuable. I think that trade was embarrassing for Bill O'Brien. I think it's embarrassing for the Texans ownership group. that they have Bill O'Brien in this position of power that he very clearly can't handle. It's clear to me through watching the Texans' transactions that Bill O'Brien doesn't understand how to manage draft capital, how to manage cap space, doesn't have a good grasp of positional value. Now, with all of that being said, he's not that bad of a head coach. I just think he's an awful general manager. 7.5 still feels pretty low for a team that has the best quarterback in this division and maybe one of the 3 best quarterbacks in this conference. Despite losing DeAndre Hopkins, it's important to note that this offense might actually still be okay. They've got 3 deep threats: Brandon Cooks, Will Fuller, and Kenny Stills. There's a good chance that not all 3 of those guys are healthy at the same time very often for this season, but they've got 3 different guys who can go deep. They've got Randall Cobb, Kiki Kuti as these pretty good slot receivers. Duke Johnson can also play in the slot. I think this Texans offense is actually going to be okay, despite the fact that they lost Hopkins. I think Deshaun Watson is a good enough quarterback to take this as an opportunity to show how great he is, because he's been a really fun player to watch so far. 7.5 just feels like a low number. This team has been winning the division pretty frequently. I'm going to go over on the Texans 7.5. I actually really like their division odds. They're plus 350 to win this division. They have the best quarterback in this division. I know that it's a crowded division because Indianapolis and Tennessee are kind of, low ceiling but solid teams. I think the Texans plus 350 to win the division makes a lot of sense. I would also throw out there Deshaun Watson is 20-1 to win the MVP. If the Texans just win 10 or 11 games and Watson is just phenomenal, it's not out of the question. I think 20-1 is a pretty good bet to make. I would just sprinkle a little bit on that. Certainly I would put a lot more on Mahomes at plus 400, but Watson 20-1 makes sense. I think Watson is one of those guys who, could win an MVP somewhere down the line. All right, moving to the AFC North. This is a division that I have a lot of action on. Starting out with the Baltimore Ravens at 11.5 as their win total. I really like the under for Baltimore. This Ravens team could very easily have another good season where they're just a very good team and they could easily just win 11 games by chance. 11-5 is a really good season for most teams, and it would be an impressive season for Baltimore again. For you to bet the over on this, you would have to bank on this team winning 12 or more games. This team just isn't that dominant. I also think that it's important to realize that this team has a fatal flaw, and we saw it in the Titans game in the divisional round. So far in the Lamar Jackson era, if this team isn't winning the game early, they're not winning the game at all. And I think it's a little bit fortunate that this team was leading in so many of their games last year. It's no coincidence that the Ravens are 0-2 against the Chiefs, and yet they're 19-1 against all other teams in regular season action with Lamar Jackson. I think that if variance works against them a little bit more this upcoming year, where they just fall behind earlier in games, it's going to work against their win total. The other thing to keep in mind is that Baltimore's probably pretty aware of their issues when it comes to not being able to win the game if they fall behind early. I'm wondering if the Ravens do more true dropbacks with Lamar Jackson, where he's really attempting to be a pocket passer. I'm wondering if they, risk expanding their offense, even if it means they go through a little bit of growing pains and they maybe lose a couple games that they otherwise would have won. I still think this team is going to be very solid, but the under 11.5 to me makes a lot of sense. I just think the Ravens have a lot of regressible qualities. So Pittsburgh is at 9.5. So last year, Pittsburgh had the worst offense in the NFL in a lot of ways, without Roethlisberger there. But their defense was so good that they actually won 8 games. They had kind of an easy schedule too. Roethlisberger is 38 years old, coming off of his surgery into this 2020 season. And the Steelers didn't even attempt to address the backup quarterback position. So if Roethlisberger gets injured again or just isn't right, we know that this team is going to sink if they have to start Mason Rudolph or Duck Hodges. I'm a little bit worried about Roethlisberger because of the age and the injury history. I'm also thinking that this defense is probably going to regress at least somewhat. You know, they might not be one of the best defenses in the league like they were last year. They might be, you know, maybe above average, but not an elite defense. If that's the case, I think under 9.5 makes a lot of sense. The other thing to keep in mind here is that I think the Browns and the Bengals are two of the most improved teams in the NFL. And so that's part of the reason why I'm a little bit lower on Baltimore and Pittsburgh. 9.5 is a relatively big number. So I'm going to go under for the Steelers. Cleveland's over-under is 8.5. I really like the over for this Browns team. If you think about the Browns, and here's the case for Cleveland. In the past, 10 years, I would say Hugh Jackson and Freddie Kitchens are two of the worst coaches any team has had in the NFL. Despite having the poorest coaching in the NFL, the Browns won 7.5 games because of the tie in 2018. They won 6 games last year. I think this team is very talented, and I'm still in on Baker Mayfield being a pretty good quarterback prospect. I think that there were some issues with his game last year that are concerning, but I don't think that, a lot of people are kind of writing him off. I don't think that last year should override what was a very impressive rookie season in 2018, along with a stellar college career. The other biggest problem, other than coaching last year for the Browns, was offensive line play. And they added Jack Conklin and Jedrick Wills Jr. Both are going to play offensive tackle. I think there's a good chance this offensive line is substantially better. Along with that, they hire Kevin Stefanski from the Vikings. I think Stefanski was a very good play designer. And I think he's going to be a huge improvement over Freddie Kitchens, who struggled with play design, struggled with fourth down decision making. I think if Stefanski is even an average coach, the amount that this team is going to improve is going to be huge because they've been dealing with the worst coaches in the league for each of the past 2 seasons. So I have a little bit of faith in Stefanski. I like this offensive line better. I still think Mayfield is a good quarterback prospect, and I still have some belief in him. And I like the weaponry on this offense. Odell Beckham Jr., there's going to be a lot of pressure on both Baker and Odell. They're both coming off of surprisingly rough seasons in 2019. But Odell is still a very talented player that you'd like to have on your team. Jarvis Landry, coming off of a good season, he's pretty talented second receiver. They add Austin Hooper, who I would say one of the 8 best tight ends in the NFL probably. And they've got the best duo of running backs in the league with Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. So I think this offense is going to be unique. I think it's going to be interesting, and I think it's going to be pretty good. It also makes sense to consider their additions on the defensive side of the ball. A lot of people are perhaps forgetting that last year, Denzel Ward and Greedy Williams were both injured for part of the season. These are two pretty talented young corners that I like. They drafted Grant Delpit in the second round. I thought he was a first-round caliber player. They also added Carl Joseph and Andrew Sendejo. I think the secondary is going to be good. I think the front seven is talented enough. So I like this Browns team over 8.5 wins. I think they are going to be a playoff team, and they're plus 190 right now to make the playoffs in some places. To me, that's an easy bet. There's going to be 7 playoff teams in the AFC. The Browns easily have one of the 7 best rosters. I think Mayfield is one of the 7 best quarterbacks in the AFC. Plus 190 to make the playoffs, I think, is a really smart bet to make. And, maybe a long shot that I would sprinkle a tiny bit of money on is plus 600 for the Browns to win the AFC North. I don't think it's out of the question. Finally, we have the Cincinnati Bengals. 5.5 is their over-under. And I like the over a lot for this Bengals team. So Joe Burrow is going to be a big improvement, most likely, from Andy Dalton and Ryan Finley. There's a chance Joe Burrow is a league average quarterback right away. I think he's a really talented player, and I think he's a relatively good first overall pick. The other thing about the Bengals is that even though they won the fewest games last year, I don't think they were the worst team in the league. Offensively, they're going to have a lot of pieces coming back this year. AJ Green didn't play a snap last year. This guy, when he's healthy, has been a top 10 receiver in the league for a while now. Even if he's a little bit worse because of age, this is still going to be a good player. They add T. Higgins. Tyler Boyd is this pretty good slot receiver. John Ross is a deep threat. I think that's actually a pretty flavorful group of weapons for this offense for Joe Burrow to work with. Not to mention, Joe Mixon's a pretty good running back. To go along with that, Jonah Williams, their first-round pick from 2019, did not get to play a snap in this past season. He's going to come in, probably try to play offensive tackle. And I had a pretty high opinion of him going into the 2019 draft, so I'm expecting him to be a pretty good player, and I think that he could help this offensive line, which still looks poor. I'll admit that the offensive line is probably the worst part of this team right now, but, Williams will help that out. And then defensively, this team was a train wreck last year, but they added a ton of pieces this offseason. They signed Trey Waynes and Mackenzie Alexander at corner to go along with William Jackson. I think their corner group is now a lot less problematic. Even though I'm not totally in love with either Trey Waynes or Mackenzie Alexander individually, I think, signing multiple guys makes a lot of sense for this team. They also drafted 3 different linebackers: Logan Wilson, Akeem Davis-Gaither, and Marcus Bailey. So that's been a weakness of this defense for a while. I think they're going to plug those guys in, and there's a pretty good chance 1 or 2 of them is pretty good right away. They signed a defensive tackle as well. I think this team is going to be greatly improved. I think the defense is going to be closer to league average. I think the offense is going to be closer to league average. I think this team is going to be a lot closer to 8 wins than 0 wins. I think they're going to move up a lot. 5.5 is their over-under. I'm going over on the Bengals. I also really like plus 725 for this team to make the playoffs. There's going to be 7 playoff teams in the AFC. I think Joe Burrow could very easily be one of the 7 best quarterbacks in this conference next year. One final bet I'll throw out there is that the Bengals are plus 2,600 to win this AFC North. if you're betting this, you're not actually thinking they're going to win the division, but it's one of those things where it's probably a positive expected value type of bet. So I would sprinkle just a touch of money on the Bengals plus 2,600 to win the division, just in case the other three teams fade for some reason and Burrow is just unbelievably good, because I think he has that kind of upside. I think he has that kind of high-end potential. So overall, I really like the direction of this Bengals team. All right, and finally we have the AFC East. Starting out with the New England Patriots, who have had a pretty interesting offseason. Their over-under right now is 9. At 9 wins, I'm going to lean a little bit towards the over. So, I don't know exactly what the quarterback situation is going to be next year. They're going into the season with Cam Newton and Jarrett Stidham. We don't know very much about Stidham, which means we don't know if he's good or bad yet. I think a lot of people are assuming he's not great, maybe because of his college resume. I will say, I was pretty impressed with Stidham in the 2019 preseason. He was a quarterback that stuck out to me. But, of course, preseason doesn't always translate to regular season play. Cam Newton has been problematic the past 12 months as a starting quarterback, but he's been injured. So it's unclear what we're going to get from Newton either, because, he's going to be maybe healthy for the first time in a while. I just think that I trust Belichick ultimately with this team. In every instance where Belichick has been coaching a quarterback not named Tom Brady in the past, 12 seasons, this team went 11-5 with Matt Castle. Matt Castle was only a 7th round pick. This team looked very sharp with Jimmy Garoppolo. So much so that Belichick actually wanted to replace Brady with Garoppolo and continue the dynasty. And I think he would have if it weren't for Kraft stepping in. Jacoby Brissett also looked competent with this team, and this team won games with Jacoby Brissett. I think Stidham is probably a little bit better than what the expectations are. I'm not as sure about Cam Newton. I still think there's a chance that the Patriots run a very unconventional wildcat type of offense with Cam Newton. Who knows? I think Cam Newton could maybe even be a wildcat offense specialist where he comes in for 20 to 25 snaps a game and runs a completely different offense, and then they throw Stidham back out there to run the regular offense. It's very up in the air. I think there's a lot of different outcomes. But I trust Belichick. I think this roster is good. The offensive line, I think, is one of the more underrated offensive lines in the league. I think their starters are solid. I also like some of their backups. And looking at their defense, this secondary is one of the best in the NFL, even aside from Gilmore. J.C. Jackson and Jonathan Jones have been really plus coverage players so far. The two McCourty brothers have been really good. They add a guy like Kyle Duggar. Belichick helps fight regression by adding pieces to his secondary very frequently. Josh Uche is also a player I'm excited for. 2nd round pick in this past draft. Good coverage outside linebacker type of player. I will admit this Patriots team does not have very good weaponry. I am a little bit concerned about their ability to push the ball downfield, but the fact that they didn't add anything to their weaponry makes me feel like, first of all, that they might be running an unconventional rushing type of offense, and secondly, that they might be in the market for trading for a receiver in the upcoming weeks. I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not, but I wouldn't put it past the Patriots. So at 9 wins, I'm leaning slightly towards the over. I was able to get their odds to win the division at plus 135 before they signed Cam Newton. I think since then it's gone to around even money. So I don't think that there's a ton of value on that, but I think over 9 wins, if you can get it at that number 9, I think it makes sense. Next up, we have the Buffalo Bills, who also have an over-under of 9 wins. I like the under for Buffalo. I think the analysis here is pretty simple. I think Josh Allen is firmly in the bottom third of starting quarterbacks in the NFL. I admit that he's gotten better at some of the precision passing underneath, but Josh Allen generally is still pretty inaccurate, and I don't love his decision making. He fumbles a lot, and he throws a lot of interceptable passes, even if not all of them are intercepted. His decision making hasn't been great. If this Bills defense regresses a little bit, I think that this Bills team could easily go under that 9-win total. So I'm on the under for Buffalo. Next up, we have the New York Jets. So the Jets over-unders at 6.5. I actually really like this team for the over. I think, Sam Darnold hasn't been very good since he's entered the NFL, but at the same time, he's been dealing with a really poor situation. I think Darnold has it in him to play well for a singular season, and I think this team offensively is going to be a lot better. They've thrown a lot of pieces at the offensive line. I don't particularly like any of the players they brought in, but the fact that they brought in like 4 different guys, including their first-round pick, makes me feel like this offensive line is going to at least improve, which is good news for Darnold. They also added Brashad Perriman and Denzel Mims at receiver to go along with Jamison Crowder. So the receivers, I think, are still relatively weak, but maybe improved a little bit. Defensively, this team was actually really good last year, and it was surprising. If they hang on to Jamal Adams and they don't trade him, I think this team could be pretty solid again defensively. And I want to point out that last season, in games where Sam Darnold started, the Jets were 7-6. They went 0-3 in the stretch where Luke Falk was starting. I think this team being 7-6 just shows that they're a pretty good team. And, as much as Adam Gase gets criticized, I think he's slightly undervalued as a head coach. And he has actually brought some questionable teams to the playoffs in his career, in Miami specifically. So I wouldn't put it past the Gase and Darnold combination to be slightly better than we think. For their over-under to be 6.5 is surprising to me, considering that they went 7-6 with Darnold last year. They're plus 200 to make the playoffs. I do like that bet as well. With the 7 playoff teams, I think the Jets could slide in and be that weird team that kind of just makes it randomly. And the last number I'll throw out there is they're plus 950 to win their division. I'm not overly impressed with any of the 4 teams in this division. I think it's probably the weakest division in the NFL. Plus 950 just feels like a positive expected value type of bet. Those odds are such a long shot, but I feel like the Jets could easily be favored a lot more than plus 950. So I would sprinkle a little bit on that. And I do like the Jets over at 6.5 and plus 200 to make the playoffs. So the final team in this video is the Miami Dolphins. The over-under is 6. I think with this number at 6, I think it makes sense to either lay off of it or to go slightly under on the Miami Dolphins. It's important to note that a team's plan can override the talent on their roster. And, just going back to last year, the Dolphins won 5 games. The roster was so bad, they probably should have won only about 2. And they ended up winning 5 because Fitzpatrick played very well down the stretch last year. If whoever they're starting at quarterback this year plays worse than Fitzpatrick did last year, which is pretty likely considering that they're going to either play Fitzpatrick again, who might regress, or they might play Tua Tagovailoa, who is going to be a rookie with what is a pretty weak set of receivers and a poor offensive line, then this team will probably win, be expected to win fewer games than they did last year. Of course, you factor in that they did add a bunch of pieces to their defense. Byron Jones was a good addition. Noah Igbenogany is in a good situation for himself. He can be the third corner. They also added several other pieces. Brandon Jones at safety in the draft. They signed Kyle Van Noy in free agency. This roster is greatly improved. I just think people might be overestimating improvement versus just being good. I don't think this team is good yet, but I think they're very improved. Again, just going back to that offense, I think it's pretty clear Miami has a below average offensive line, despite the fact that they threw a lot of darts at it in the draft and in free agency. And, we don't know who's going to be starting at quarterback. I would just rather go with the under on Miami if I had to choose, but laying off of it also makes sense. So that concludes this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast. Again, if you're interested in this kind of thing, there is going to be a twin podcast to this one going over the NFC over-unders and other bets that I like. Thanks for listening.